All right, and welcome to today's workshop for anyone joining us out in YouTube or via Zoom. My name is Leon Prather. I'm the manager of digital services at the Mariners Museum and Park. For anyone that is joining us, we're so glad that you are here, and know that you do have the opportunity to chat with our presenter in the chat box on the right, but you also have the ability to watch this video later on. If you happen to have to leave, this video will stay at the same link that you clicked to get here as well. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our presenter, Brock Switzer.
All right, thank you. Looks like we are good to go. Welcome everybody and thank you for joining us for photosynthesis, our workshop where we're going to be talking about how to capture really good landscape and nature photos using your cell phone, something that we just all pretty much always have on us all the time. As Leon said, my name is Brock Switzer, and I'm the collections photographer at the Mariners Museum and Park. The images that you're seeing on the screen are a pretty good example of some of the stuff that I do on a regular basis when we're at work. I'm mostly in the studio photographing artifacts. I'm also doing digitization work and photographing staff portraits. But I also help with our marketing efforts, with the occasional event photography request, and then also documenting our beautiful park. I went to Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in media arts with a concentration in photography. I've got about 12 years now of professional photography experience, and I've been at the museum for almost 5. So without further ado, let's dig in to cell phone nature photography. And I want to start by telling you that there are some pros to using your phone for photography, and there are some cons to using your phone for photography. This list is comparing cell phone photography as opposed to a full manual digital SLR camera. They're obviously really different beings. As you can see, the lists are pretty similar in terms of length. There's a fairly equal amount of pros and cons to using your cell phone versus a full manual camera. That said, it's going to come down to what you personally prefer and also what level you want to reach. So for example, if you want something that's going to be convenient and fast for you, something that you're going to have in your pocket, it's easy to travel around with and take pictures with, then cell phone photography is great. If you're looking to have a little bit more control, a little bit more range of what you're capable of doing, and especially if you're looking to go into photography as a more serious hobby, a paid hobby, or even as your career, you're eventually going to want to transition over into full manual SLR photography. But cell phone photography, in addition to being convenient, is also a really nice way to start to practice the artistry of photography before you have to worry too much about the technical aspects of photography. But we're going to talk about the technical just a little bit too. First, I want to go over just some of the symbols that you're going to see in your camera app, just in case you don't know what some of these things do. This is a screen grab from my phone, which is an iPhone 8. I'm working with an old one because that's what I do. I'm super cheap when it comes to technology. So these symbols might be a little bit different for you, but they're probably going to be something similar. So the first one here that we see, those 3 overlapping circles, that's effects. These are effects that are applied before you take the photograph. I don't recommend that you use these. Anytime there's a filter that you can apply before taking an image, I say don't do it. The problem with applying it before you take the photograph is that it's applied permanently. That effect is on your image forever. You can never, ever take it off. The problem with that is that if you come back to a photo down the line and you think, oh, I don't really like the way that this looks, I wish that I had taken this in color instead of black and white, you can't revert. So if you're going to apply effects to your photo, do so afterward, not before. The next one that looks like a clock is a self timer. That's good for selfies, obviously. For what we're talking about today, it's a little bit less useful, unless, of course, there's something that you want to have in really sharp focus. You can set a self timer on your phone, sitting somewhere stable, walk away from it. That way there's no shake from your hands, there's no vibration from you breathing or moving around. So that's always an option. Most of the time, self timers can set for 2, 5, or 10 seconds, roughly. After that is live mode. I don't know if this is available on Android phones. It is on iPhones for sure. Live mode basically shoots a video instead of a photograph and then lets you go back through that video and select a screen grab. So you're pulling one moment from that video and using that as your photograph. Usually the resolution takes a little bit of a hit because it's shooting video as opposed to a photo. But that can be really good if you've got a subject that's moving around a whole lot, so you can find a frame where they're in a good position and they're nice and crisp focus. After that, we have HDR. Most of the time, I think you're going to just see that as the letters HDR, which stands for high dynamic range. If you're not familiar with photo lingo, dynamic range means the difference between the lightest light and the darkest dark in your image. So the range from highlights to shadow. Camera phones don't have a very good innate dynamic range. It's a pretty shallow range that they're capable of emulating. If you've ever taken a cell phone photo outside on like a bright sunny day, you've probably witnessed this happen where your highlights are either going to be really blown out and your shadows will be really dark, or vice versa. So what high dynamic range does, this mode, is that it captures several photographs at the same time. It will take one that it considers to be perfectly exposed, one that it considers to be overexposed, and one that it considers to be underexposed. It then takes those images and it mashes them together, choosing the correctly exposed parts from each one so that you get a broader range, and your highlights aren't blown out, your shadows aren't way too dark, and it's a nicer overall image. So it's sort of faking dynamic range. The problem with HDR mode is that it will make your photo slower. So if you're photographing something that has movement to it, HDR mode might not be great. You can always increase contrast, brighten shadows, or darken highlights later on using your phone's photo app to edit your photo. And last but not least is flash. Don't use it. Don't use it. It's just not going to be a terribly appealing look. So I don't recommend it unless you absolutely feel like you have to. All right. So we're going to talk about.
So this is technical photography. So we're only going to hit on it briefly, but technical photography is important to know even when you're not really using it as much as you would if you were doing a full manual camera. So there are three components to the exposure triangle: the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture. So starting with shutter speed, that controls how long your shutter stays open. Cell phones don't actually have a shutter in the traditional sense. So really, when we're talking about cell phone photography, we're talking about how long your sensor, which is the thing that's collecting light information, is exposed to the light. On a traditional camera, there's a shutter that actually opens and closes, and you can change how long it's open for. This controls how much light is allowed to get through at any given time. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, which is sort of a confusing moniker. This controls how sensitive your camera's sensor is to incoming light. The higher your ISO is, the more sensitive it is to light, meaning the brighter your image can be. The lower that your ISO is, the less sensitive to light, the darker your image can be. So it's a sort of secondary method for controlling light. The problem with ISO is it's one of those things that's a little bit too good to be true. ISO, when you increase it, makes it easier to photograph in the dark, but it also increases what's called noise, which is the digital equivalent to film grain, only significantly less attractive. Noise digitally can really make your image look fuzzy and out of focus and soft, but not in appealing ways. It's sort of, if you've seen photos before that look speckly, that's ISO. That's a lot of noise being created by a high ISO number. Okay, then the to the right there is aperture. So aperture is also called f-stop. And it controls how wide your lens opening is. The confusing thing about aperture is that the higher number you have means the smaller the opening. The smaller the number that you have, the larger the opening. So it sort of works in reverse of what you would regularly think that that you would. So the interesting thing about aperture is that your
cell phone camera actually probably doesn't let you change it. If your camera lets you change any of these settings at all, which in a lot of situations it's not going to, it's going to take full automatic control. Aperture is going to be the same pretty much no matter what. Your cell phone camera very likely has a static aperture. For instance, mine is a 2.8. The numbers don't really matter right now. You don't have to know exactly what that means. But because it's a low number, you can equate that to meaning that it's a wide open lens. A wide open lens also means that you're getting what's called a shallow depth of field, which means very little of your visual plane is going to be in focus. So the closer you get to something, the less of that is going to be in focus, which can actually be really nice. That's how you get those blurry backgrounds that you've seen before, blurry twinkling lights in the background. That's called bokeh. Those are all controlled by a low aperture. So really your phone is a little bit limited in that it has a shutter speed that's variable and it has an ISO that's variable. Chances are that it is taking both of those things fully automatic. It's deciding based on what it can see, what both of those need to be at. You might be able to have some control over it. And if you do, I recommend using your shutter speed to adjust lighting whenever possible, rather than ISO to avoid getting that noise. So you can control the exposure a little bit, not necessarily through the numbers, but by tapping on your screen. So you don't have manual control over everything, but you can tap on your screen and then swipe up or down to lighten or darken the image. And your phone, based on how far you swipe, will automatically adjust those numbers for you. So keep this in mind whenever you're taking an image. If the highlights seem like they're way too bright, or if the or if you need the shadows to be a little bit brighter, you can swipe up and down to try to get those dialed in. You can also handle these things in post, but it's always a good idea to get as close to your final image, what you want your image to look like, as soon as you can when taking it, rather than doing a lot of adjustments afterwards. Tapping on your screen is also the way that you're going to select your focus when we're talking about cell phone photography. So if you need to select a focal point, just tap on your screen at the point where you want your camera to focus and it will adjust. If you're ever too close to something and you tap on the screen and it's not focusing, the reason for that is because you're just too close. Your camera isn't capable of focusing on something that close. So if you ever see that happen, take a step back, tap on the same spot, and you should see it come into focus. That's just a good thing to remember. And again, your screen might look a little bit different than mine does based on what phone you have, what model you're using, but they all work roughly the same with the tapping and the sliding to control the focus and the exposure, which is about the extent of manual control that you're going to get. There are also apps out there that will let you take manual control of your camera. I've played around with some of them. I'm not wildly impressed. They're good for some things. They're not so good for other things. Honestly, I recommend just letting your camera have automatic control, using the tapping and the swiping to take a little bit of control, and going from there. So since we don't have a lot of control over the manual aspects of photography, the technical aspects of photography, the thing that we're going to focus on the most is the artistry of photography. That's what we can control when we're looking at cell phone photography. We can control what our images look like in terms of composition, in terms of how they're laid out. This is a great quote from Henri Matisse that says, "Composition is the art of arranging in a decorative manner the various elements which the painter, in our case photographer, uses to express their sentiments. In a picture, every separate part will be visible, and everything which has no utility in the picture is, for that reason, harmful." So what he's saying in simple terms is when you're going to take a picture, everything that you see in your frame is going to be seen in the final product. If it helps your composition, if it adds to the image, it's great, it's perfect, it's something you really want in there. If it doesn't add anything to your image, if it doesn't inform the viewer, if it doesn't point them to what you want them to look at, feel, think about, then it's not doing anything. And so it's not really helping. In fact, it could potentially be hurting your images. So we want to try to really think about composition when we're doing cell phone photography, because that's the one thing that we have real control over. And composition is broken down into finding a focal point and providing that focal point with balance. So whenever you're looking for an image, you're going to select your focal point, the thing that you want people to look at, the thing that you want them to be most aware of, and then you're going to provide balance to that focal point by placing other visual elements around it to support it, enhance it, and to make sure that people understand, hey, look, this is the thing that I want you to see. This is what I want you to notice. So there are a few ways that we can do that. One of the most important things to remember whenever we're looking at composition work, especially in photography, is that especially when you're looking at a full landscape, you should select your subject first. If you don't select your subject first, then you are going to have a really hard time placing other visual elements to provide balance for that subject. And landscapes that don't have a subject, don't have a large focal point, aren't going to be as successful. They're going to just sort of be bland. People aren't going to want to spend time looking at them or exploring them. So the image that you're seeing here, for example, that tree is a really dominant force visually. It was right up front. It was something that I thought looked really nice with that sunset in the background. And so I chose it, placed it where I wanted it in the frame, and then sort of moved myself around until I found an angle that I thought was good, that provided that interest in the foreground with the fencing, the cows, the sunset off to the right-hand side. So we're going to take a look at some of the basic rules of composition and break them down a little bit so that you can understand ways to do this, ways to find your subject, place it, and then inform visually. So one that you might have heard of already because it's the most popular one, it's probably the easiest one to remember, is called the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds breaks your frame down into 9 equal boxes by placing 2 lines vertically and 2 lines horizontally. What you do then with those lines is you place your subject off to the right third or the left third, the top third or the bottom third, and you avoid placing your subject in the dead center. This makes images more pleasing to the eye. They actually feel more stable, but also more interesting and dynamic, as opposed to placing something dead center, which can really tend to make it look a little bit bland, a little bit boring, not really as visually impactful as it could be. So the easiest way to do this, especially when you're starting out, eventually you get to the point where you just naturally look at things in you'll naturally start to see things based on the rule of thirds. So the easiest way to do this when you're starting out, though, is to utilize your camera's innate grid. So you can turn on your grid. It's going to vary a little bit where you find this. For instance, I had to sort of dig through the settings menu to locate this whenever I turned the grid on. Some of you might have it. Some of you might have it in your camera app itself, just right there, ready to go, where you can just click turn on grid. You might have to dig in a little bit further. So look around for it. It's worth turning on because then you can place your subjects a little more easily when you're first starting out. So for instance, in this one, with the butterfly, you can see that it's placed off to that right-hand third, sort of up into that top right, and it's not placed dead center. The flower that it's sitting on is a little bit closer to center, but since the subject matter is the butterfly itself, it's off into that corner, dominating that corner visually in order to make it a little bit more impactful. It would be a much less interesting looking image if that butterfly were dead center in the frame. So we can take another look at an example of the rule of thirds in this one, which is sort of a minimalist approach, but also you can see is very, very clearly using the rule of thirds. That horizon line along the top is running along the top third. That very strong tree branch is along the left-hand third. So it's sort of divided up the frame. The rest of it is that sort of just muted gray and white color. So this is a minimalist approach, but again, try to think about this image. If those branches were dead center in the frame, it would probably create a much less visually compelling image if it weren't moved off to the side a little bit, just to give it some space to breathe and to follow along with those thirds. So something that's going to sort of immediately break the rule that I just told you to follow is something along the lines of this image, which follows the rules of symmetry. You're going to find that happening a lot, where there's going to be images where you're told, hey, here's a rule, follow this rule, and then you're almost immediately going to be told, hey, here's another rule, and it's going to be completely different. So your job as a photographer is to sort of pick and choose which rules you're going to follow based on the situation you're presented. This one lent itself to symmetry beautifully. This wouldn't work as well, I don't think, if it were rule of thirds. If that horizon line were higher or lower, I don't think it would be as impactful as it is dead center and stick straight. The important thing, if you're going for symmetry, is that you have to be super, super precise, meaning you have to make sure that if you've got a horizon line like this, it is perfectly straight across your frame. If it has any tilt whatsoever, it can make the image look really unsteady. It can make it look really uneven. It can throw off the symmetry. Another one for this one is that the really important part of it is that reflection being crystal clear. A situation where if that reflection hadn't been crystal clear, it wouldn't really have been symmetry. It could have been an interesting image, but it wouldn't have been quite as intense as it is. Another thing to keep in mind with symmetry is that you can sometimes go with something called near symmetry. Near symmetry is slightly different and a situation where it's not quite as important to have perfect, precise lines. So for instance, this one, you can see that it's not quite exactly even. Those branches are a little bit off. Mushrooms following down the middle are a little bit off, but it's a really pretty perfectly divided frame. Texture becomes really important with this, and it's very close to symmetry, but it isn't exactly symmetrical. So that's something to keep in mind that you can do too. And this is a situation where that played a really important part. Again, I don't know that this would have been as good if the mushrooms had been fully off to the left or right side. I think they make sense in the middle, and it's almost symmetrical, so it becomes a more interesting image. Something similar to what we've got going on with symmetry is repeating patterns. Repeating patterns are really boring, as a lot of us are figuring out as we're in quarantine. It's not the most fun thing to repeat things day in and day out, but in photographs, they can actually get really interesting. So I really encourage you when you're taking nature and landscape photography to look around for anything that is repeated and find a way to sort of look at it visually. There are two different kinds of repeating patterns, and there are unbroken and there are broken. So to give you a good example of that, this is a broken repeating pattern. Those diamond shapes, those lines are all very strong repeating patterns, but the sort of chaos of the vines and branches and everything that are behind them break up the pattern a little bit. So the repeating pattern is the strong visual element. It sort of becomes the subject itself, but it's broken up a little bit and made a little bit more interesting with those vines. If those vines hadn't been there, this could still potentially be a really interesting image. It would just be an unbroken repeating pattern. You usually want to try to find something, though, that sort of messes with your pattern at least a little bit in order to make it a little bit more visually interesting. In this image, you can see that there's a really strong repeating pattern that's sort of broken up a little bit by color. If these had all been exactly the same color, they may not have been quite as interesting. But note too with this one that with symmetry, and you saw it in the last image as well, precision is really important again. I wanted all these boards to be looking roughly the same size. I wanted those vertical lines to be very straight vertical. Those screw heads are all very straight horizontal. So again, if you're photographing something with the intention of repeating pattern being your focal point, then you want to make sure that you're being precise about it. If you're not being precise, then it could get a little bit visually messy and not quite as impactful. Another way to make for an interesting image, and again, sort of the exact opposite of some of the other things that we've been talking about, is to simplify your frame. Strip away as much as you possibly can, except for the thing that you really want people to focus on. So this was actually just on a path in the winter when I was out for a walk with the dog. I looked down and saw this really cool swirled pattern in the ice, and I wanted to take a picture of it. So I took a picture of just it and nothing else around it. The shadows kind of come in as a strong visual element, but mostly this is about that swirl, and it's about the texture of the ice and the dirt. I took away as much visual element as I could to make sure that this was punchy, make sure that this was the thing that you're looking at, the thing that is strongest, so that there is no doubt in your mind, this is what I want you to look at, and you can spend time looking at it. It's interesting enough on its own without me trying to add anything more to it. So part of being a photographer is also understanding when enough is enough. I think there are a lot of photographers out there who sort of don't understand that concept and they want to fill their frame with as much information as they can. And they think they always have to follow every single one of the photographic rules, which you really don't. I'm presenting these to you so that you understand them. And I'm presenting these to you so that you can walk away with simple guidelines for how to take interesting images. But at the same time, I want you to break these things. There's a difference, though. Breaking the rules because you didn't know them to begin with doesn't really lead to great photography. Breaking the rules because you know them well enough to understand when they should be broken does make for good photography. So that's my little soapbox moment with what makes good photography and what makes not so great photography is at least understanding the rules so that if you break one and I ask you, why didn't you try for the rule of thirds? You can tell me exactly why you think that it looks better without. So keep that in mind. All right, another example of a simplified frame, this time really taking advantage of that shallow depth of field that I was talking about to simplify the frame. This toad was amazing, by the way. He sat there and I had my phone basically touching him almost, and he had no care in the world. He just sat there and let me photograph him. I took so many. I've got like 50 photos on my phone. But this one, what I wanted was his eye and the texture of his skin to really be the important parts of this image. So getting really close to him gave me that opportunity to take advantage of that shallow depth of field so that nothing else in the frame really matters except for this toad and that really cool golden color in his eye and that really interesting bumpy texture of his skin. So simplify your frame, pare out anything that you don't think is absolutely necessary to try to tell your story. Another way to take interesting photos using your cell phone is to go for abstraction, to go for something that's a little bit outside of the box, something that might take a little bit more thought to digest fully as opposed to an image where you've just force-fed your viewpoint to your viewer. Abstraction can be really interesting. I was seeing that we were talking about Hampton Roads in the chat. If any of you are from this area, then you absolutely know what this is, even if you don't quite know it just yet. That right there is pollen on water. Again, a situation where I was just walking past a pond. It had this really interesting pattern to it. This was right after I moved to Hampton Roads, by the way, and it took me a long time to understand that that was pollen. I have never before in my life seen that much pollen. I have since, though, all over my car. But this is a way to create interesting visual images. This doesn't really follow any specific rules of photography. It's just an abstract image with that cool swirling pattern, these really interesting colors. It sort of looks like the surface of a gas giant planet. So that's a really interesting way to take cell phone photography and make it something more unique, is to make it abstract. It doesn't have to be perfectly, clear exactly what you're looking at, as long as it's visually sort of impactful. Another way to mess with people's perception is to sort of manipulate their perspective. So we were talking earlier with symmetry about the importance of being precise, sometimes being imprecise, sometimes tilting, sometimes throwing things off. In this case, flipping it upside down makes for a more interesting image. So this was right after a storm. In the summer, there were these bubbles that were forming on top of the parking lot outside of my apartment. And I thought it was really interesting. And I took a picture of it. And I was looking at the picture later and was like, this is okay, but it's kind of boring. And then I was just messing around with it, flipped it upside down. And suddenly, instead of being bubbles sitting on top of a parking lot, it was bubbles floating up into the air around all these cars. And it became a much more interesting photo. So sometimes just flipping photos around, tilting horizon lines, that sort of thing can make for an interesting image. But again, just accidentally doing those things doesn't necessarily make for a good photo unless you understand why doing those things made it more visually interesting. All right, something else that you really want to keep in mind when we're talking about the artistry of photography is depth and perspective. Photography, by its nature, is taking something three-dimensional and flattening it down into something two-dimensional, which can do exactly what I just said, flatten it. It can make it look really shallow and not as grand as it possibly could be. And especially when we're talking about landscape and nature photography, you sort of want to bring in some of that grandeur. You want to make it clear to your viewer just how big the thing that you're having them look at is. And so we have a couple tricks for how we do that. The easiest one to think of is linear perspective, which is exactly how our eye judges distance. So that's based on the way that things seem to diminish in size as they get further away from us. So this is a good example of that. it has a few things going on that inform. So you can see this fence here that follows along and curves off to the right all the way back. These repeating slats that are going up and down, these trees that are equidistant and spaced and diminish in size, this path that sort of curves around, all of those visual elements that get progressively smaller as they move back into the frame can visually tell our viewer that this is a big scene. This goes back a good way. You're seeing a decent amount into the distance. It gives it some depth rather than flattening it into a two-dimensional thing. It allows us to really understand the depth of the image. Another good example is this one, which is similar to that first one in that the repeating pattern of this bridge sort of lends itself visually to telling the viewer that they're looking at something that's sort of disappearing into the distance back here into the trees. So it starts large here, gets progressively smaller. Our eyes are visually able to understand that as getting further away, which gives the image depth. Another thing to think about when we're providing depth visually is the vanishing point, which is the point at which parallel lines seem to converge, the point where they vanish, the point where they become one thing. And this one, by the way, I would still count this as a landscape, but it's something that we would consider to be a manufactured landscape. This is a man-made thing, but it's still outside and it's pretty interesting. This is the underside of an overpass. We know that this is that these are parallel. We understand that they are running side by side back into the distance, but because of the way that this has been taken and the angle that it's been taken, we see these lines sort of trail off backwards until they, whoop, that popped up right at the bad time, until they sort of disappear there at the very bottom part of the frame. That motion provides us with depth. We understand that these are parallel lines, but because they seem to be coming together in the distance, we visually interpret that to mean depth. There are a lot of things that can make that really easy for you, including paths, piers, roads, bridges, fences, railroad tracks, so on. Anything that has strong parallel lines that seem to converge in the distance can provide your viewer with that sense of depth and moving back into an image. Another side effect of this, another really good reason for using a good amount of depth indicators in your images is that it provides the viewer time. The worst thing that you can have happen when you're a photographer is that you take an image, somebody looks at it briefly, and then they move on. You want them to spend time with your photos. You want them to look into them. You want them to see some small details. And this is one of the best ways to do that. Your eye wants to travel back that path. It wants to see what's back there. And so you're going to spend a little bit more time looking at this image because you want to, your eye sort of wants to wander back into it. So it's a natural indicator of spending time with an image and giving the eye somewhere to go rather than just looking at the image and going, yeah, okay, that's nice, and moving on. Something else to keep in mind is providing foreground interest when you're photographing a landscape. If you're photographing something way in the distance, a mountain or something like that, it can be beautiful and it can be really interesting. But sometimes it helps to just visually provide people with something right in the foreground to just give them an idea of how big the thing is that they're looking at. So in my example of photographing a mountain, if there's a tree in the foreground that you can get part of, just to sort of provide some context for the distance of this. So this one is just a sunset over a parking lot. But the way that the light was reflecting off of those cars in the front, that interesting curve that it provided, that little pop of red down in those shadows, helps to give you an idea of just how big the sky looks and how grand those clouds are, and helps to provide just a little bit of visual information without really taking away from the punch of that bright red and yellow and orange sky behind. Another thing in cell phone photography that we can talk about that's really helpful is to keep in mind mood and color theory. So again, since we don't have a lot of manual control over our photographs, we can take control over how people feel whenever they look at them, how we want them to feel whenever they look at them. And we can do this in a couple different ways. One is to create a mood. So if you see a situation like this one, this was up in Newport News Park. It was winter, all the trees were bare. This was up in the swamp area. There's this gnarled old tree that made me feel like I was about to start some sort of fantasy adventure. So I took a picture and actually later on in post-processing with it, really diluted the colors down so that it felt kind of cold. It's a little bit ominous, it's mysterious. That vignetting on the corners helps to sort of push you deeper into it, as do those, again, converging lines. Remember, with the lines that sort of disappear into the distance and converge, we've provided depth to the viewer. So it sort of makes you feel like you're ready to start an adventure, right? You want to know what that tree is going to provide you. Contrast that with this image, and we've created a completely different mood. So where that one was winter and sort of ominous and mysterious, this one is summer. It's warm. These yellow tones, the magenta tones, the green tones, all sort of help to make it warm and inviting. It's a nice field of flowers. It's comforting, it's calm. You don't expect anything mysterious or anything like that. So you can create a mood based on what you're seeing. So this is a really good example, I think, of creating a mood. So I have two photos for you that are of the exact same scene and actually taken not that far apart from each other. So this one is evening with that nice sunset, those muted, soft tones in the sky, and then that bright pop of golden, orange, yellow of the sunset reflected in the water. The sort of cattails growing up in the front. Again, a situation where the image is calm, it's relaxing, it sets a mood where you want to maybe just sit down beside this lake and watch the sunset. Contrast that with, I think maybe a few weeks after that, when we had a snowstorm, and that same scene goes from being warm and inviting and comfortable to being cold and a little bit scary, maybe a little bit spooky. Instead of wanting to sit down next to this lake, you want to book at home and have a hot drink. So you can really create different moods based on the time of day that you photograph, the season that you photograph, and just visually you can give people a feeling. So that's something that's really interesting that you can do with cell phone photography, with any photography really. But again, since we can't focus so much on technical photography, cell phone photography lends itself really well to this. So color and then color temperature. Color temperature is measured in degrees Kelvin. 5,500 is considered daylight. So what you consider to be daylight is 5,500 degrees Kelvin. Above that is really warm. It's yellow tones. Think about like tungsten lighting, sunset, that sort of thing. And then below that is bluer tones. You can think about LED lighting, which has that blue tint to it. Morning light has usually a blue tint to it. And they also read warmer and cooler. So yellow tones usually read warmer to us. Blue tones usually read cooler to us. So this is an image that was taken up near Shenandoah Valley. It was a very, very cold morning, and I wanted to make sure that my photo evoked that cold. You can see the frost on the backs of these cattle, actually. You can see on their backs there that there's frost. There's frost on the ground here and on the tops of these fence posts. So you can visually see that it was cold, but by giving you the blue tones of this image, because it was early morning, and by reducing that yellow a little bit more in post-processing, I really visually provided you with the indicators that this is cold. This is very cold, and you maybe want to like bundle up. Another image that's a great example of using color is this one. This is a close-up of a mushroom. This one sort of falls in the line of the abstraction, because it's as close to it as you can really get. But this one's going to feel different than that other one because it's reds, oranges, and yellows. It's going to feel warmer. It also, because it's sort of spraying outwards to the edge of the frame with those really warm colors, sort of feels invigorating. It sort of wakes you up a little bit to look at an image like this. So pay attention to your colors in your image, because you can really inform a viewer and make them feel a certain way based on what color temperature you're photographing at. And that's a good way to be a visual storyteller, and provide them with some sort of subtle cues as to how it is that you want them to feel. All right, I'm going to be happy to take some questions and answers. I'm going to do a social media plug for you, though. If you don't already follow the Mariners Museum on social media, I highly recommend it. You can find us at Mariners Museum on Instagram and Twitter, the Mariners Museum and Park on Facebook, and you can see some of our hashtags there. When the park is open back up, I would love if you would go out and take some pictures using some of these tips, and then tag the Mariners Museum on them so that we can take a look at them and see them. I also put my personal Instagram on there at brock.switzer. Feel free to follow. You can send me any messages. If you ever have questions about photography, I'm more than happy to answer them. Or if you just take a really cool photo and you want to show me, I will absolutely get super happy about it and celebrate with you, especially if you've used some of the tips and tricks that I've taught you here. So follow social media, Mariners Museum, send me messages if you have them, and I am happy to take any questions that you may have.
All right, so anyone out in YouTube, feel free to continue asking questions there, and anyone here in Zoom, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll call on you. I see someone raise their hand and then they put it down really fast. I think that may have been, yes, I've got them here. All righty, Arlene, you are free to talk.
Oh, send. Got to put in send.
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. How do I do a screen grab? I lost a really great picture of a couple of jets because I couldn't keep them in the frame. And if I had been able to do a screen grab, then I would have been able to get them.
Is this a photo from the presentation? Do you just need us to go back to the slide for you?
No, it's when I take pictures around here, my subjects do not like to stay still. And some jets were doing a flyover and I would have gotten them, but it was on live and they went out of the picture and I didn't know how to do a screen grab to get them back.
Gotcha. Do you were you using live mode on your camera?
Yeah.
So let me pull up my phone because I remember how to do this, but I need to make sure I'm telling you the correct information. You should be able to, when you go into your image, it should say live at the top of it.
Right.
And then if you go into edit, you'll see the live view symbol down in your edit screen, and you can click on it and then scroll through the whole live stream that it took, and select your frame.
I'm just gonna see if it's okay. There's live, and I'll figure out how to get to edit. Oh, edit. Okay.
Yep, and then you should see the live view symbol down there, the bottom left.
Okay, it says loading, auto, and right now it's gosh, I don't even know what that's supposed to look like. I pulled it up, I hit edit, it brought me the thing, and so how do I adjust it then?
It should show you when you click on that live view symbol, it should show you sort of a timeline across your bottom of different stills. So you should be able to just click through those and select the one that you want.
Okay, I was just using a regular photo because I think that one accidentally got deleted also.
Oh, okay.
But I was just using the egret from this morning.
Oh, gotcha.
And that one, there isn't a bunch of pictures of it. It was actually standing still that time. But at least now I have an idea of what I'm looking at or should be looking at.
Yeah. If you're taking a picture of a subject that's moving, like you said, a jet going overhead or something like that, live view is really helpful so that you can go back later and find the frame where it looked really nice and was where you want it to be. So I recommend using it.
Because I have a problem because usually it's birds, clouds, or jets. And a lot, except for, well, the clouds sometimes stay still.
Yeah.
But the birds absolutely do not.
Nope.
You have to kind of chase them around. And that's about all you can do.
That's right. Yeah.
It's just hit or miss.
Right. Yeah. Live view should help you just to get them a little bit more steady.
Okay. Let me see. I think that was a real question that I was asking. Oh, wait a second. Let me see. I know there was something. A lot of times when I'm trying to take a shot of the full moon, it what do you call it? It lightens it up automatically. Is there a way you can get it to stop doing that?
Yeah, so you can do the thing that I mentioned where you can tap on the screen, and I would tap right on what the moon itself, and then drag your finger down, which will that should solve it for you, because that should make it so that that it'll darken it for you. It'll eventually go back to lightening it. It's always going to eventually just adjust it back to what it thinks it should be. So you might have to do that repeatedly until you get it right. But that's what I would recommend. Tap on it, drag your finger down, and that should darken it a little bit.
Great. I'm sure there's other people with questions.
Thank you for that, Arlene.
Thanks, Arlene.
All right, we've got another type-in question here. When using a mobile phone, would you recommend using any of the exposure controls or leaving everything the way that it is as a default and then editing things in post?
So the best thing to do when we're talking about photography is to get your photo as close to what you want it to be when you take the photo. I think that the Photoshop wizards out there have sort of built up this misconception that you can just take a photo with whatever it is, and then you can go into post later on, and that can be your way to actually dial it into what you want it to be. But the best thing you can do is to take the photo as close to what you want it to look like to start with, and then edit as little as possible later on. So I recommend using control over your photo as much as you possibly can. Like I said, in most situations, iPhones, I know they don't give you manual controls. There are apps that give you manual control, but using that, like tapping and then swiping up and down, is a good way to get yourself at least close to the exposure that you want on your photo to begin with, so that you don't have to do quite as much editing later on. To dig into that just a little bit more, our phones naturally are taking JPEG images. JPEG photos are compressed and they're small, and that means that they're prone to losing data as they're manipulated. So the more you edit your photos from your cell phone, the blurrier they can get, the lower the quality. Just by nature of the file itself, they'll eventually start to degrade a little bit. So try to get it as close as you can when you're taking the photo. Edit as little as possible later on.
All right, I actually think that might be the end of our questions for the moment. Let me
Okay.
just check here and make sure we're not skipping anything here. No, I think we're fine unless anyone wants to ask anything else. Oh, I'm sorry. We actually have one more raised hand here. Just 1 second.
Okay.
All right, it's actually Arlene again. Arlene, you are live again.
Hi, Brock.
Hi.
Do you recommend like some kind of program that you can use, like Photoshop, but something that's good for dummies? Because Photoshop, I've tried it before and it's way too. I have Photo Suite that's a gazillion years old.
Gotcha.
And it does exactly what I want it to, but sometimes there's a little more that I'd like to do and it won't do it.
So if we're talking about on your computer, I think that
Right.
Adobe Lightroom is what I would recommend to you. So it's the same company that does Photoshop. Lightroom is a photo storage app, but it also has editing controls that are advanced, but not nearly as advanced as Photoshop. So it's sort of a good in-between point where it's got a lot of controls that you can play with, and it's fairly user-friendly, but it's not nearly as advanced as Photoshop. So it should be a little bit easier to understand. Plus it helps you to organize. You can rate photos as you go, like this one is a 5-star. So later you can pull up all of your 5-star images and that sort of thing. So I recommend Adobe Lightroom. It's really good. I don't really know, it's obviously a paid service. I don't really know any of the like free ones very well, if any of them are good. But I think Lightroom would be right up your alley.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. And I think that is it for our questions. So again, thank you all so much for attending. I hope that you got something out of this, and I hope that you'll get out and enjoy some fresh air and try out some of these techniques. So thank you again and have a great day.
You too. Bye.